This is about extension tubes, teleconverters, filters, and bellows that you can use for getting close-ups. And this is gonna, there we go. There are a lot of different ways that you can make macro and close-up photos. Macro lenses, of course, but you can also use extension tubes. There are close-up filters. You can take a standard lens and reverse it and attach it to your camera backwards. You can use a teleconverter with a telephoto lens, and there are bellows. A little bit of terminology to start out with. Close-ups are basically any time you're taking a picture where you're getting in close to it. But for it to be considered a macro photograph, you need to get the subject at least equal in size on the frame to what it is in reality. And micro photography is when you get magnification that's even higher than 1:1. And I'll show you some examples of all of those things. Macro lenses are the most common thing that people use to go into close-up and macro photography. The most common ranges are in the 90 millimeter to 110 millimeter range, but you can get them longer than that. Some of them are 150 millimeters, up to 200 millimeters. Canon makes a 180 millimeter lens. And with macro lenses, you can get up to 1:1 reproduction ratio. So in other words, reasonably large. Here's an example of Nikon's 150 millimeter lens, macro lens. This is their new Z lens. This is by far the best lens that they've ever made for macro photography. It is razor sharp. It's much better than the older F-mount 105 millimeter lens. And you can get up to a 1:1 reproduction ratio with this lens. Sigma makes one in the 150 millimeter range. The advantage of this is that you can be a little farther back from your subject. And when you're doing things that are easily frightened, like insects, that's a real advantage. One of the advantages of this lens and also of the Nikon are that they autofocus. And that's important because on mirrorless cameras, it means that you can do focus stacking, something that you may very well want to do with macro photography. This lens also will get you up to 1:1 reproduction ratio. Nikon used to make a 200 millimeter macro lens. This is the longest macro lens that's available anywhere that I'm aware of. This is an F-mount lens. It's older. It's not for the Z-mount cameras, although you can use it with the Z-mount camera. It's out of production now, and I don't know whether they intend to release a Z-mount version at some point. But this gives really good distance from subjects, not only insects, but I've seen photographs people have taken of rattlesnakes, for example, using this lens where you can get enough distance to maintain some safety. The disadvantage of this lens is that it won't autofocus on mirrorless cameras, on Nikon's mirrorless cameras. It will autofocus on the DSLRs, like the D850. But if you're going to use it for focus stacking, it really won't work on a Z mount on a mirrorless camera. There are also special macro lenses where you can even get higher magnification than 1:1. Here's one by Mitakon Ziongi. It's their 20 millimeter super macro lens. It has variable magnification. You can dial in the reproduction ratio that you want, and it'll go up to 4.5 to 1 reproduction ratio. That makes it a lot harder to focus because you're in very tight. If the camera wiggles at all while you're focusing it, it is a manual focus. It's hard to tell when it's in focus. You have to get this lens really close to the subject, and I'll show you an example later where I got really close with it. And stabilizing your camera on a tripod is a critical issue. You'll note the little knob at the top. That is actually the lens size. It's a very small lens. This one runs from f2 to f16. And if you were going to focus stack with this, you would have to do it manually or with a rail, focusing rail like Stack Shot. Here's another one, an 85 millimeter macro lens by Laowa. This one also is variable magnification that'll go up to 5 to 1 reproduction ratio. Again, stabilizing your camera is a critical issue, as is focusing. But because it's 85 millimeters, you get more, you can maintain a greater distance from your subject, which is important from a lighting standpoint. There are alternatives to using macro lenses. You can use extension tubes. You can reverse your lenses. You can use close-up filters. You can use a teleconverter, and you can use a bellows. And I'll talk about all of those options. Extension tubes are one thing that's commonly used in getting close-ups and macro photography. Basically, they're just tubes that go between your lens and the camera. They don't have any glass in them. So there's no degradation of the image quality from the glass. They're inexpensive. You get them in different sizes. You usually get a set of them, 2 or 3 in a set. Common sizes are 11 millimeters and 18 millimeters. You can use them individually, or you can stack them to get greater magnification. You can get reproduction ratios higher than 1 to 1 by stacking your lenses, and you can stack it with a macro lens to get even more magnification. You can get extension tubes that will couple with your camera so that you can meter directly. Although I don't know, some of them may offer autofocus capability as well. This one, the Miki extension rings were made for the Nikon Z-mount cameras. You can get other mounts for like Nikon's F-mount or other cameras. As I mentioned, there is no glass in them, so there's nothing to cut down on the image quality. And this one will autofocus. You can also get variable extension tubes. This is one by Savage for Nikon. It's an F-mount, but it ranges between 55 and 71 millimeters, so you can basically dial in the amount of extension that you want to get. That's a very high range extension, and it would get you a very high degree of reproduction and magnification. Canon, there's also one for Canon. It's a slightly different millimeter range than it is for Nikon. This is very easy to adjust, very easy to use, and not terribly expensive, under $100. I don't remember exactly what it was. In addition to extension tubes, you can get close-up filters. Basically, they are like any kind of camera filter. They're easy to use. You screw it to the front of your lens. They will improve your closeness, but you don't get nearly as much of an improvement in the reproduction ratio as you would with extension tubes. You could put it on a macro lens. Normally, though, the one that Canon makes is intended to go on a telephoto lens. You can get cheap ones, I mean, very cheap, but they are also poor quality. If you want to get good quality results, you need to buy a good quality filter. Canon probably makes the best one out there. It's usable on any lens. Doesn't have to be a Canon lens. You can also get used Nikon ones. Nikon doesn't make them anymore, but they're widely available on eBay for not terribly great amounts of money. Then you can reverse a standard lens. This isn't something that a lot of people do, but it's fairly easy to do. You buy a cheap little reversing ring that screws onto the front of a 35 to 50 millimeter lens and allows you to put the lens on backwards, so that you're basically focusing with the front of the lens toward the camera and the innards pointing outward. This gets you a closer view of your subjects. It has the advantage that if you already have a 35 to 50 millimeter lens, you can use the lens that you already have. And it's an inexpensive way to get close-ups. Here's an example of a really a cheap 35 millimeter lens that I bought. I think I paid about $30 or $40 for it on eBay. A cheap reversing ring, that probably was under $15. I mean, we're not talking much money here to do this. And as I mentioned, you basically screw the reversing ring to the front of the lens and then mount the lens backwards.
Norm?
Yes.
Now, if I'm looking at this correctly, that means it's going to be manual focus and manual exposure setting, correct?
That was manual focus.
All right, and exposure as well, because I didn't see any contacts
I'm
for.
sorry. I'm sorry, Steve, I didn't hear you.
Well, I didn't see any contacts on that, so it wouldn't be auto metering either.
That's correct. It would be you would dial it in using the aperture ring. So you need to get one that has an aperture ring. An old lens would be best for that. You can also use teleconverters with a telephoto lens. Teleconverters do have glass in them, so that they will cost you some light. The typical lengths are 1.4x or 2x, and a 1.4x teleconverter will cost you about one stop of light. A 2x will cost you 2 stops. You do lose some image quality with them, although you may not notice that very much. It depends on how critical your focusing requirements are. You do need to match the teleconverter to the lens that you're going to use it with, which means basically you need to use the same manufacturer, and in some cases you have to use specific lenses. Nikon's Z-mount teleconverters only work on 2 of their telephoto lenses that I'm aware of. And if you tried to use it with another lens, you would perhaps not get good results. You use it on a telephoto lens, and I'll show you some examples later. Basically, it's better for longer distance shots where you're trying to bring in a subject closer than it is for getting really close, although you can do some, some decent work with them. This is what the Nikon 2X teleconverter for Z mount lenses looks like. You could also get a 1.4X one. And as I mentioned, you need to match it with a specific lens. It does require you backing off from your subject. You can't get very close to your subject with that, and I'll show you what that means later. Finally, you can use a bellows to get close-ups. Basically, a bellows is just a really long extension tube that you can change the distance on. You do with all of the things whether extension tubes or anything that you put between the lens and the camera does cost you some loss of light, but it allows you to get, extremely close results. It's very hard to maintain stability with a bellows, and there's a risk of using them in that as you sort of pump the bellows in and out, you can risk sucking dust into your camera sensor, so that there is a risk of using them. There aren't very many makers of high quality bellows. The best of them are very expensive. I mean, we may be talking thousands of dollars. The less expensive ones don't have meter coupling. Here's the Nikon PB6 bellows. I don't think it's produced anymore, but you can still get it. It does require a very steady tripod. Focusing, I can tell you, is extremely difficult. It can position you very close to your subject, which makes lighting a problem. So those are the options. Let's look at some examples of using the gear. What I've chosen to use for comparisons is an 1889 Morgan half dollar. And basically all of the pictures that I've taken are of this coin mounted in the same way with an alligator clip. This particular shot was taken with a 40mm f2 lens. The specs are there. All of the shots that I've taken are f8 and ISO 64. The shutter speed will vary depending on what I needed to do to get lighting. In this case, the sensor plane on the camera was 10.5 inches from the coin. Now I need to make a confession. I screwed up when I made this presentation. I cropped the photos so they would fit on the screen. So what you're seeing is you can see the quality of the images, but it's not a fair comparison of the reproduction ratios. So if you think you're seeing something big, it may not have really been that big in reality. If I were to do this over again, I would have to not crop any of the images so you could see the difference in size that you get from each of the lens options. But this is the close-up using the Nikon 105mm macro lens. Again, f8, ISO 64. And in this case, it was 11.5 inches from the sensor plane. And it gives you a very nice, sharp rendition of the details of that coin. if you stack it with extension tubes, you do get a closer view. If I had used F22 or instead of F8, perhaps the hair would have been a little sharper. But it's, you know, the nose and the eyes are still reasonably sharp. I did use all of the extension tubes that I had, 29 millimeters, to extend that. It left the camera about 12 inches from the image plane, I mean, the subject about 12 inches from the image plane. And I had to increase the exposure a little bit because there was some loss of light using the extension tubes. Then, and obviously the image is a little darker as well. The Nikon's 200 millimeter macro lens gives you a lot more distance. This too gave some pretty decent results in terms of sharpness. In this case, the sensor plane was 20 inches away from the subject. So you can see that you get basically a foot additional distance by using the 200 millimeter versus the 105 millimeter lens. The Sigma also gives really sharp results. I think these results are as good as any of the others. In this case, it was 11 inches from the sensor plane. So it got pretty close. Now, if you go to some of the special macro lenses, this is the Laowa 25 millimeter lens. It's set to reproduce at 5 to 1 reproduction ratio. In this case, I was 8 3/4 inches from the image plane, and I did use a focusing rail to do the focusing. It's almost impossible to do that. I mean, you would have to focus manually, and it's almost impossible to do it by turning the focus ring. It's just too crude. So what you do instead is move the camera back and forth toward or away from the subject in order to get critical sharpness. And you can see that you can get, you know, to the point of seeing, you know, very tiny scratches and imperfections in the coin. This is the 85 millimeter Nikon Zhongyi at 1x. And in this case, it was 16.5 inches from the image plane. And again, I used the focusing rail. If you go to 5x with that same lens, the exposure time was increased. And in this case, I was 12 1/4 inch from the image plane. But you can see the great enhancement in detail that you get from using that lens. The super macro 20 millimeter lens, in this case, this is at 4.5 to 1 reproduction ratio. And the image plane was 4 3/4 inches from the subject, but I can tell you that the front of the lens was about 1/8 inch away from the subject. I mean, it was just about as close as I could get and still make an image, which in which case lighting actually becomes a problem because the lens gets in the way of lighting the subject. So having some distance is a good thing. Here's an example using that 35 millimeter lens reversed. And in this case, it was 6.5 inches from the sensor plane. I frankly don't like the results of this image as well. It seems softer to me. But then it was an old lens. Probably not a very good lens. And I have no idea how old it is, but it goes way back. A newer lens or a macro lens might, be a better option. Here's using a teleconverter. This is the Nikon 70 to 200 millimeter Z lens, using that 2x teleconverter that I showed you earlier, with it focused at 70 millimeters. And in this case, I was 20 inches away from the sensor plane. Nice sharp results, not a lot of magnification compared to especially the special macro lenses. Here is the same image with the lens focused at 200 millimeters. And in this case, in order to get maximum sharpness, I had to back off 41 inches from the sensor plane. So in this case, you're like more than 3 feet away from the subject. This is not not really a great way to make macro photographs. In fact, it isn't. You can't make macro photographs this way. You can make close-ups. And I know, Bob has done a lot with telephoto lens to bring flowers in nice and tight, so that you could use a telephoto lens with a teleconverter to get bigger results, basically. But they're not going to be the highly detailed macro images that you can get with a macro lens. Finally, I used the bellows, and I've got to admit that I had a lot of trouble focusing this. It took me a long time to get it to the point where I could even figure out where to position the bellows to get it in focus at all. I'm unhappy with the sharpness of this. It's very fuzzy. The lens was about 1/8 of an inch away from the coin. I had to get that close. And the sensor plane was about 7 inches away from the subject. My guess is that there are ways to get the bellows extended a lot more than I did, to get higher resolution than I was able to achieve. And frankly, it was so much trouble, I just gave up on it. So here are some tips for making macros and extreme close-ups. First of all, you must use a steady tripod. Stability is a critical factor, and any kind of vibration that you introduce is going to show up in unsharpness. You're going to get if you're using a macro lens, your best focus is going to be not by using the focusing rail. On some of mine, I did use automatic focusing, but for a lot of them, I used the focusing rail to dial in the greatest sharpness I could get. And I think that's where you're going to get your best results. When you're making your focuses, if you have a mirrorless camera that has a screen that allows you to zoom in to a higher magnification, do that so that you can see clearly exactly when you have things in the sharpness that you want them to be. Use a high f-stop to get the best depth of field. People say, well, you're going to lose resolution from diffraction by using a high f-stop. The better lenses don't cost you very much in that regard. You don't lose very much resolution that way. Everything I shot was f8. That was really way too low for the best results. F16, F22 would be a better choice for the best depth of field. That is, unless you're focus stacking. If you're focus stacking, then F8's not a bad choice. Lighting becomes difficult when you're focusing close to a subject, especially if your lens is, the front of your lens objective is an inch or less from the subject. You get into a situation in which the lens actually blocks the light, and that becomes a problem. You do lose lighting as you increase magnification. You just have to compensate for that and change your exposure, basically change your shutter speed in order to get the lighting that you need to get. I highly recommend using a remote triggering device. If you try to use the shutter button, you're going to introduce vibrations in the camera. You can use a delay once you push the button, have a delay before it fires, and that's another way of dealing with it. I use a device called a foolography that allows me to use my iPhone to trigger the device. It also lets me change the exposure without touching the camera. And I think I can get, sharper results that way. It's useful to let the camera rest for several seconds after touching it before you make an exposure to allow it to stabilize, again, so that you reduce vibrations. So you have some options. You can get really good results with macro lenses, and that's a good starting place. If you're looking for high magnification, then there are a number of special macro lenses out there, not all that expensive. Basically, they're coming from China, but the quality is not bad. Another option is extension tubes, which are inexpensive and convenient. The reversed lens option is inexpensive, but I find it limited, and it's not, you can do it, but it's not something I highly recommend. I couldn't find my close-up filter to show you an example of the results of that. They're easy to use, but like reversing your lens, it's limited in terms of its applicability. And the quality can be an issue if you don't buy a really good quality lens. A teleconverter, I think, is probably a poor choice for working in a studio, but if you're working outdoors, trying to make close-ups of flowers and things in nature, it has some real applicability, especially where you have the opportunity to back off from the subject. You can use a bellows for extreme macro photography. I think that's a highly specialized application that is difficult to use. So that's the presentation.
Just, for something quick and handy, I have an Olympus Tough TG6. It has an incredible, what they call microscopic mode or microscope mode, macro mode. It's an f2, it's a standard compact camera, 2.3-inch compact camera sensor, but it does good quality optics. It shoots raw, even in microscope mode. So for, just a quick capture, I found that to be very useful rather than digging out my SLR with the 105mm Nikon F 2.8 lens on it. And it has outperformed my expectations.
Good to hear it.
Norm, so you have all the equipment you showed us today is in your,
Sadly, yes.
I mean, and what you know blows my mind every time,
Yes,
right? I mean, how
Yes.
do you know all of this? Thank you.
amazing.
That was amazing.
Yes, thank you. But he couldn't find the one.
If you're a follower of Mike Moats, who is uh, sort of the guru of close-up photography of late, he's moved away from using close-up lenses, macro lenses, and his philosophy is becoming, you can use these telephoto lenses, these new ones, because they're so sharp, and with a 45 megapixel camera, you can really have a lot, not have to get in super close, because you can crop and you don't really lose much because of the high pixel count. So he's been really preaching. I don't agree 100%. I still would favor my Nikon 105 Z lens over a telephoto, but between the sharpness of the lens, the megapixel count of the sensor, and the sharpening software that's available in post-processing, you can do a lot with your telephoto lenses and your longer lenses.
What do people like best for sharpening? I mean, is that a fair question to ask? I know it's not exactly on point, except I'm just curious.
Ellen, I didn't quite hear you. I'm having trouble hearing.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You were
In
asking
post,
about sharpening software.
yeah, in post-processing, what is your favorite? I've heard a lot of different things.
There are two things that I use. I use the Topaz Sharpen AI, or they now have a Topaz Photo AI, which I think is their next version. But lately, I've been using the DxO Deep Prime, and that is really giving me good results. It only works on RAW files. I've got a lot of TIFF files that I can't use it on, but and then I would go to the Topaz for that. But it'll take a somewhat fuzzy picture taken years ago on a poorer camera or with a poorer lens and make it look pretty sharp.
So that's D prime or deep? DxO deep prime?
Deep as in DEEP.
Okay.
I forget the product name exactly. They've got a couple of products out there, but the one that I'm using, the element in it is called Deep Prime.
Okay, cool. I have a version of Nick software that I've hardly used, and then they wanted me to upgrade for quite a lot of money, and I thought, yeah, I didn't use it enough to make it worthwhile.
I've never used the Nick sharpener, so I can't comment on that.
Which is another reason why folks are tending to use higher and higher f-stops, 36, 32, 36, 64, whatever you can get up to. Even though you have diffraction, these software, the new sharpening programs, it really doesn't matter. And the flip side of that also is noise reduction. I don't really care about my ISO setting almost anymore.
Wow.
I've been taking pictures of my grandson playing soccer, and I set the camera at 5,000 shutter speed, f16, and let the auto ISO. I get great pictures. So noise reduction and sharpening is almost almost doesn't matter what you do with the camera anymore.